now watching Way Back Wednesday, sponsored by Davenport Auto Park, the ride of your life. And also sponsored by Flores Glass, serving the area since 1977 with residential and commercial work.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to another episode of Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. Lee was just telling me how to do a double take on the start there to get the intro in, so if you were tuning in and watching, you might have got a little double whiff there. That's okay. Thanks so much for joining us again. Always good to have you with us. In keeping with the last 2 or 3 weeks' shows, tonight we're going to look at both a home residence as well as a couple people who occupied that home for many years ago. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the Falls Road area. When I was a child, I attended Wilkinson Elementary School for first, second, and part of third grade. We lived at that time on Columbia Avenue, so I would walk down Columbia Avenue up to Ridge Street, turn and come down Ridge Street till I got down there to Cap's Grocery at Falls Road. Sometimes I would turn left and walk down Falls Road and turn and to the right a couple blocks down and go over to Wilkinson School. Other times we would go up all the way up to Mill Street and turn left on Mill Street and go down that way to get to the school. But anyway, there was a house that I always remembered to this day that I always thought was the neatest house. And it's the house at the 600, address is 600 Falls Road. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. It's got it's a 2-story house, got a real pretty front porch on it. It's just a really neat residence. And so I thought it would be interesting to take a look at that house and a couple of the occupants of that house and trace a little history of the residents and the people who live there. So without further ado, let's jump right into this. You know, if you watch the show each week, you know that I have a couple tools at my disposal that I use to put together the show each week. Number one, without a doubt, is the newspapers.com website. I've literally fallen in love with that website. We have a subscription here at the studio, and of course I have access to it in my office. And it is by far the number one go-to mechanism when I'm looking at historical items, whether it be businesses or people, individuals, or homes. And there's just a wealth of information there. And so I go there first. You've heard me say and talk about the City Directories. They go back to 1908, 1909 in Rocky Mount. They mysteriously stopped around 1963. I'm not sure why that is. I keep thinking I'm going to get by the public library and talk to Tracy up there and see if she can shed some light on why we can't find a city directory past 1963. There may be some in the library. I've honestly not gone and looked. But as far as what I can find online, just about every year from 1908, 1909, all the way up through 1963, there are city directories available that are free to access, by the way. You can download them as a PDF file. And if you watch the show again, you know I quite frequently refer to the city directories, and I use them as kind of a backdrop to get some more information when I'm researching a topic, whether it be an individual, a business, or a home. So I went back to 1908 when I found out. First of all, let me back up a minute and say there was 2 prominent citizens that have lived at number 600 Falls Road over the years. Going back to the 1930s, a gentleman named W.S. Wilkinson lived there. And then around 1955 or so, Jimmy D. Smith, tobacco man from Rocky Mount, moved in that same house. And so that was interesting to me that I knew Mr. Smith, actually. I never knew Mr. Wilkinson, but I did know Jimmy Smith. And so I started going back to see what I could find, first of all, about Mr. Wilkinson. So I went all the way back to 1908 in the city directory and then looked into Rocky Mount Telegram, and I found an advertisement that appeared in a paper called the Rocky Mount Herald. You may remember we talked about that before. Rocky Mount had 2 or 3 publications in the early 1900s, and the Rocky Mount Herald certainly was one of them. And so at that time, in April of 1908, there was a full-page ad, and I realized when he put on the screen, you're not going to be able to read it, so bear with me. But I wanted to put it up because it talks about a business that I remember as a child, and I didn't know this man was associated with it. So Lee, if you could, go ahead and put item number 1 up on the screen for our viewers. And this is just an annual statement that appeared in the Rocky Mount Herald in 1908, and it's talking about the Citizens Building and Loan Company. And now that I look at this thing again, I think I'm confusing this with another company called Citizens Savings and Loan. I don't think it's the same company, actually. But there was a gentleman there who was a member of the board of directors by the name of Mr. W.S. Wilkinson from Rocky Mount. He was actually the secretary and the treasurer. You can see right there under management, his name is listed, W.S. Wilkinson. And there was two of these gentlemen. There was his father and his son, of course, and W.S. Wilkinson Sr. Quite often went by Senior, and of course his son, W.S. Wilkinson Jr., went by Junior. So the father, and this is important to keep in mind because I'm going to be bouncing back and forth between these two gentlemen throughout the show tonight. The father died in 1931. So anything that we're referencing after 1931 is going to be W.S. Wilkinson Jr. I actually am not 100% certain that this W.S. Wilkinson here is not the junior also. It's possible. He was actually born in the 1800s, so he would have been a very young man if, in fact, he was this gentleman. But this is a statement of the liabilities and assets and so forth of Citizens Building and Loan. And the numbers are kind of, for this period of time, 1908, they had assets of over $10,000. They had liabilities of just about the same thing, same amount, I should say. They, of course, had stock. There's a listing of their receipts and their disbursements. But the main thing I want to point out here, and some of these other names will be familiar to you, too, if you watch the show week in and week out. In 1908, the president of Citizens Building and Loan was Mr. J.C. Brazel. I already mentioned Mr. Wilkinson was the secretary as well as the treasurer. The company had attorneys J.B. Ramsey, J.P. Bunn. The directors included Mr. J.C. Brazel, Mr. T.L. Worsley, Mr. E. Epstein, B.B. Williford, G.G. Levy, T.C. Gorham, Dr. M.R. Brazel. And that's, by the way, that's Dr. Mark Brazel. If you remember, Thomas Hackney Brazel Memorial Library was named after his young son who died. I found something else interesting tonight about Dr. Brazel. When the Spanish flu epidemic came through Rocky Mount in 1917, 1918, his wife also died. I didn't realize that, so I was reading earlier tonight when I was reading about Mr. Brazel himself. And we'll get to that a little bit later on. But Mr. R.S. Gorham, E.J. Gordon, C.L. Gay, and Mr. G.S. Edwards and Dr. L.C. Covington were all on the board of directors for the Citizens Building and Loan Company in April of 1908 when this article appeared. So then I got to look and I said, okay, so let's fast forward a bit. And the next item I came up with was actually a picture that appeared in the paper many years later, but it's a throwback to 1930. And so if you would, Lee, go ahead and put up item number 2. And this is a list. It's captioned "Real Old Timers," and it says this photo represents the board of directors of Citizens Building and Loan Company about 1930. Tom Jenkins Jr., 219 Villa Street, furnished the Herald Studio picture and was able to identify the men, most of whom are now deceased. This picture appeared, like I said, in the Rocky Mount Telegram. I want to say it was in the 1950s, and it was taking a look back at these gentlemen from 1930. And it says front row, W.A. Meadows, John J. Wells. John J. Wells, by the way, was instrumental in developing and getting the West Haven subdivision off the ground. Mr. Robert Sides, Josh Horn, we spoke about last week. Mr. J.C. Brazel, George S. Edwards, we talked about him. He had the store over on Marigold Street. Mr. Ed H. Reeves, E.I. Fleming, and W.C. Woodard. And it says standing left to right, George R. Edwards, M.D. Munn, Sam Toller, Millard Jones, W.B. Lee, that's another tobacconist, R.R. Gay, Russell R. Brazel, J.P. Bunn, and W.S. Wilkinson. It goes on to mention R.G. Murkinson, W.C. Devine, Frank Wilkinson, Dallas Alford, M.P. Dawson, Wiley Mears, and Luther T. Bullock. You know, when we talk about these gentlemen in Rocky Mount's past, it's amazing to me that these gentlemen achieved such notoriety, number one, in their professional lives, as bankers and attorneys and various business leaders. But they were also very involved in the community in a multitude of other ways. They were on board of directors of several different organizations and events. I've read, for example, the original senior W.S. Wilkinson was actually the one who started the Red Cross chapter here in Rocky Mount, and it was during the Spanish flu epidemic or pandemic in 1917, 1918 that got started. We'll show you a picture of that a little bit later on in the show. But these gentlemen all, one by one, had again reached the pinnacle of their, in their professional lives, and yet still found time to be on various boards and committees. It makes you wonder how they had time to have any kind of personal life at all. It really does. Okay, let's go to item number 3 then, and this is from 1934. And in 1934, this was just a list of Planters National Bank. The last couple of pictures have been from Citizens Building and Loan Company. This is Planters National Bank from 1934. And you see on the left-hand side of your screen there, it lists the directors. H.B. Bryan, George S. Edwards, again, run the store on Marigold Street. Mr. M.R. Brazel, J.C. Brazel, H.B. Marriott, M.D. Munn, J.P. Munn, S. Robinson, Robert D. Gorham. That would have been Bobby Gorham's father that started Tarrytown Mall. Millard F. Jones, James F. Hines, W.C. Woodard, W.B. Lee, and of course Mr. W.S. Wilkinson, and then R.R. Brazel at the very bottom. So again, these gentlemen had, in addition to their chosen profession, they were members of various boards of different banks and financial institutions and loan companies and so forth. It just amazes me that they didn't spread themselves so thin they couldn't get anything done. But obviously they were successful in their endeavors and were largely responsible for a lot of Rocky Mount's growth in the 20s and 30s and 40s and so forth. Okay, let's go to picture number 4, Lee. In 1934, I found a listing in the Rocky Mount City Directory from 1934, and it lists here, you see it, there you go, zoom out a bit if we could, Lee, so we can see the whole thing there. W.S. Wilkinson Incorporated, George A. Wilkinson was the president, George W. Wilkinson was the vice president, Thomas E. Jolly, secretary-treasurer, general agency for Old Colony Insurance Company. So Mr. W.S. Wilkinson Sr. was very active in the insurance industry. In fact, I read one article that said he was instrumental in starting up one of the, I want to say Fireman's Mutual Insurance or something like that. And so he was also one of the founding members of course, Wilkinson and Bullock Real Estate Company here in Rocky Mount. Down at the bottom there, you say William S. Wilkinson Jr. He was the president of Wilkinson Bullock. His father started, he was the president. And he was also, you can see there, he was director of the Citizens Building and Loan. He was a lawyer, and his office was on the second floor of the Planters National Bank building at 100 Main Street Southwest. And you see there at the very end of that listing, the little H stands for home residence, and his home residence was 600 Falls Road. So in 1934, William S. Wilkinson Jr. was living in the house we spoke about earlier at 600 Falls Road. That I didn't realize when I was walking by that house as a child who lived there, anything about them, frankly. I just knew it was a big house and someone probably fairly well off and fairly influential lived there. But it's amazing over the years the people who did live in the house, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other ones in a moment. Let's go to lead to number 5, item number 5. And we talked a couple weeks ago, if you remember, about efforts, there were a couple efforts, in fact, over the years to do something with the train tracks downtown Rocky Mount, whether it was build a bridge over them or dig a trench and put them down inside it below the street level. So, and I realize you can't see this article, and I apologize. I was hoping when I saved it, it would be a little bit easier to read. But the couple things I wanted to point out to you. By the way, this appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in March of 1937. And the headline says, "City will employ experts to study railroad matter." And it says, "National known appraiser and engineer to make survey of proposal here." Alderman staged lengthy and dramatic meeting with railroad tracks and city, furnishing chief topic for discussion. And it says an appraiser and engineer, nationally recognized experts, each with a lifetime of experience in investigating railroad projects, will settle once and for all Rocky Mount's question of how the railroad crossing problem can be solved and when and for how much. The Board of Aldermen decided last night after nearly 3 hours of discussion. And it goes on to talk about everything they discussed. It says J.W. Roberts, a financial expert and head of a well-known Norfolk appraising firm, spoke. He gave his opinion about what would be involved and how much it would cost. And then the city has allocated money in this report here, in this article, of $167,000 just to do the research and find out what's going to be involved in moving these tracks. Of course, the end result was it wasn't practical, wasn't cost effective, and they didn't ever do anything. Obviously, the tracks are still where they were, still at street level, and it's still a pain in the butt for anybody's got to go across those tracks several times a week to and from work. But I stumbled across this, and Mr. W.S. Wilkinson was very much involved. He was an alderman, by the way. In addition to everything else, he was an alderman, city alderman in the 1930s. And so he was one of the ones that was heading up this effort to do something with the railroad tracks, get them, as I said, lower down below the street grade in a tunnel of some sort. They looked at several options, and when it was all said and done, it just wasn't anything that was practical at that time. And so, it was a lot of hoopla, a lot of discussion, but when it came down to making something happen, they realized it just wasn't practical. So in the end result, nothing did happen. Okay, so that was in March of 1937. I mentioned that Mr. Wilkinson was a very prominent attorney already by the 1930s. When I did a search, as I quite often will do in the newspapers.com website, I punched in W.S. Wilkinson, and I always do a year range from like 1920 to 1930, 1940 to 1960, whatever. But when I did a search for Mr. W.S. Wilkinson Jr., there were literally thousands of responses that came back. Now, a good many of them had to deal with Mr. Wilkinson's involvement in real estate transactions, handling people's deed transfers, this kind of stuff. So there was a lot of listings that appeared in the paper, and they still to this day you can see when anyone buys or sells a piece of property, there's always a lawyer involved in the process. And so a lot of the results I found with my search had to do with that. But interestingly enough, there was just about as many on his wife as there were him. And his wife, again, was quite common back in that time and period of the country. She was and I mean no disrespect by this, if anybody's related to her, but she was a socialite. She would have bridge meetings or bridge games at her house, for example, and very affluent ladies from Rocky Mount would all gather, and they would be served little snacks on dainty little napkins and sip tea out of dainty little cups and talk about each other and those that weren't there. And I'm sure it was all in good fun, but there was an awful lot of activities that Mrs. Wilkinson was involved in. She was instrumental in the Girl Scouts here locally, for example. She would host Girl Scout leader sessions and so forth at her home. She was involved with the Red Cross. She was involved with student nursing and so forth. So there was just a lot about her in the articles that I found when I did a search on him, and quite often it never listed her first name. It was always Mrs. W.S. Wilkinson. And so anyway, in 1937 I ran across this article that appeared in the paper, and it's just an example, and it says Ms. Wilkinson honors visitors at Bridge. And it goes on to say, Mrs. W.S. Wilkinson Jr. entertained at Bridge at her home on Falls Road on Thursday evening to compliment a trio of attractive visitors in the city, Mrs. Douglas Gordon, Miss Madeline Magnuson, and Miss Annabelle Halderan of Winnipeg, Canada. 16 guests made up tables for Bridge, which were arranged in the living room and library of the spacious home. Mrs. A.T. Thorpe scored high at Bridge and received a costume flower, and Mrs. C.C. Ward was given a boudoir novelty as holder of the floating prize. Ms. Wilkinson presented decks of cards to the 3 honored guests as remembrances of the occasion. The group progressed after the termination of 8 hands of play, and at this time, iced drinks and assorted sandwiches were served. Later, a delicious course of ice cream and cake was followed by salted nuts. Mrs. Wilkinson combined a variety of seasonal flowers in the decorations for her home, using pink dahlias and roses in the living room, roses and asters in the library, and a combination of pink dahlias, asters, tuberoses, and phlox in the dining room. Making up the group were Mrs. Douglas Gordon, Mrs. Annabelle Halderson, Mrs. Madeline Magnuson of Winnipeg, with their hostess, Mrs. C.W. Bailey, Mrs. Thomas C. Shore, Mrs. C.C. Ward, Mrs. R.A. Broom, Mrs. Travis Davenport, Mrs. C.C. Harris, Mrs. John M. King, Ms. A.T. Thorpe, Ms. Lyman Melvin, Ms. Leon Timberlake, Ms. Woodall Rose, and Ms. J.L. Rawls, Ms. Lyman Jones. So, and I saw many articles just like this throughout the years where Ms. Wilkinson would host these gatherings, these parties, these bridge games and so forth. And it was just, it was kind of nostalgic to think about. I don't know if anybody does bridge games at Rocky Mount anymore. I've not heard about a bridge game being held in Rocky Mount in many years. But for these ladies to gather, and I'm sure they were all dressed in their finery, and it's like a fun time, and I'm sure it was for the ladies. And you just don't hear about this kind of stuff anymore. And sadly, it's kind of from a bygone era. The next item I ran across, you know what, before we get to that, I just realized it's almost time for our first commercial break. So Lee, let's go ahead to our break. When we come back, folks, we're going to talk a little bit more about 600 Falls Road. Some of the other folks who live in the house, going to show you some pictures. The house is gorgeous inside and out, by the way. You won't believe it. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family, and we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
Back. Folks, if you're just tuning in, you're watching Way Back Wednesday. I'm Randy Adcox. We're talking about the W.S. Wilkinson father and son, Junior and Senior, and specifically the house that Junior and his wife lived in at 600 Falls Road. As I said at the top of the show, I used to walk by that house on the way to school sometimes. I rode by it a couple days ago, in fact, and every time it's just, you kind of got to stop and look at that house, even if it's only a moment as you're riding by, just kind of look over at it. It's been there as long as I can remember, certainly before I was born, many years before I was born. And the fact that it's still there is a tribute to the people who have decided to own that house over the years and keep it up. And it really is a beautiful home. In 1941, I was looking through these articles and looking for specifically anything to do with the W.S. Wilkinson, senior or junior, either one. And I stumbled across this article that appeared in May of 1941. And two things about this jumped out at me immediately. Lee, if you would, put item number 7 up on the screen for our viewers there. And this was appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, as I said, May of 1941. And if you would, back out so we can get the whole thing on the screen there. And you see the major headline, War Effort. Now, again, this is May of 1941. If you remember from your history class in high school, the United States didn't enter World War II until the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. So I found it interesting that there was a war relief campaign underway in May, literally 6 or 7 months before the United States ever entered the war. And So I'll read what this says here. You can see on your screen there. You can read along if you choose to. It says, editors note, this department is conducted by members of the Rocky Mount War Relief Council, and opinions expressed therein need not necessarily coincide with those held by this newspaper. And it goes on to say, a number of inquiries have been received by the War Relief Committee as to whether the present campaign for hospital beds for British hospitals is to be shortly followed by another money campaign for war sufferers. The War Relief Committee does not propose to have another campaign before fall. A campaign for used clothing during the summer is likely. Checks for $40 each for hospital beds with equipment are acknowledged from the following. Family of Mrs. W.S. Wilkinson Sr., owners of Arlington Terrace, officers and employees of G.R. Garrett and Company, John Ennis, officers and employees of Wilkinson Bullock and Company, Keel Avera Incorporated, officers and employees of the New Home Building and Loan Association. The time to act is now. So obviously this is an effort to raise money to send to Britain for hospital beds. You see there's a mention of a used clothing drive. So, you know, a lot of folks don't realize that before the United States got involved in World War II, it had been going for a few years. And so by this time, England is certainly deeply involved in the war, as is much of Europe. And so there was, you know, efforts to raise money for hospital beds and medicines and supplies. I just thought it was a neat thing that these families were involved with. And I never knew that the W.S. Wilkinson Sr. family were the owners of the Arlington Terrace apartments. So something new there too. All right, so let's fast forward a little bit then. May of 1942, and I mentioned at the top of the show about these business professionals who were involved in so many different activities, and that theme just played over and over and over with the same names, I should add. Fathers and sons carried on the same tradition, and there was just an awful lot of this being involved in not only your own profession or your own business, but other things around the community, whether it be being on a board of directors for a bank or a loan company, or being involved with some kind of civic organization or fundraising campaign, or something like the Gallopade committee to, you know, have the Gallopade parade, or the June German committee to do that. So Lee, if you would, let's put up item number 8 on the screen. And this is just another example of these gentlemen and they're being involved in several different things. At the top of the picture, by the way, this appeared in 1942, and you see at the top it says 1907, 1942, and you see the two gentlemen there. That's Mr. J.C. Brazel on the left and Mr. George S. Edwards on the right. And these men were the president and director. The stockholders, the top of it says the stockholders of the Citizen Building and Loan Company hold their 36th annual meeting. And you see there the two gentlemen at the top of the page. And then it goes on to talk about the loans they've made, the money they've got outstanding, their liabilities and resources and so forth. And at the very bottom, under officers and directors, again, you see the same names that have been involved in these types of industries and businesses, banks primarily, and loan and so forth, associations. But the same names: George Edwards, M.R. Robbins, Wiley Mears, M.P. Dawson, F.B. Chipley, that's Flake Chipley's father, and then W.C. Devine, M.D. Munn, Munn Griffin, M.F. Jones, C.C. Cockrell, W.B. Lee, the tobacconist, S.S. Toller, J.J. Wells again, and of course down at the bottom of the list is W.S. Wilkinson, attorney. So just one more example of these gentlemen, these business leaders, these executives, these by any definition quite successful businessmen, again just had their fingers in so many different pies, to use an old expression. And I just found it interesting that there was roughly a dozen of these men who for a period of 30 or 40 years in Rocky Mount were very instrumental in helping Rocky Mount grow and develop and prosper. They're responsible in large part for bringing new business into town, new industry, they pushed for things like, street improvements and storm drains and sewers and so forth. All these gentlemen they had a vision. I guess the best way to say it, had a vision for Rocky Mount, and they worked tirelessly to bring those visions to fruition. And then, as I said, it was a father handed down to son, the same type of mentality. And I'm not saying we don't have that today, but I have to be honest, I don't see it to the same degree that I see it when I look back at these articles from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. It just doesn't seem to be there to the same extent. And that's a shame, when Rocky Mount could use some leaders like the Mr. Brazels and Mr. Edwards there and Mr. Wilkinson. We just seem not to have enough. Let's put it that way. Okay. All right, let's go on to item number 9. I mentioned earlier that Mr. Wilkinson Sr. was very much involved, and this picture actually appeared in the paper around 1960, but it was a snapshot that was taken back in 1917, 1918, somewhere along in there. And I know you can't read on the screen, so I'll read you just a little bit of this caption here. And it says, yesteryear around here, the Red Cross of Rocky Mount from World War I, the 46 ladies who made up the active working force of Rocky Mount chapter of the Red Cross in 1917 and 1918, handling not alone the efforts undertaken locally now by the SMO and the YMCA, but who included in their wartime activity and emergency hospitals at the First Methodist Church, caring for influenza victims when all the hospitals and other medical agencies were taxed. The late W.S. Wilkinson, that would be the senior, number one and only gentleman shown in the picture, was president and directing head of the organization. And then it goes to list all the ladies here. I'm sure some of these ladies are married to some prominent men in Rocky Mount. I recognize some of these names. But, this was pretty interesting that hospitals were full. There was the whole medical system was taxed to the limit because of this pandemic, this epidemic of Spanish flu. And so these women were, going out and volunteering. Leela Chesson wrote a neat article I shared with you a little bit later on. Back in 1975, I think it was. She interviewed W.S. Wilkinson's daughter. And her daughter, his daughter, I should say, was involved in this effort to take care of sick people. And of course, her family was very much afraid that she would too catch the flu and die from it. And she talks about how she witnessed so many people who got it and did die, and she was very fortunate she did not. But that was a risk that every one of these nurses took, providing aid and care for these very, very sick people, many of which did not make it. I mean, that flu was, it showed no mercy. It killed young and old alike. Okay, I'll tell you what, let's go to item number 10 if we could. And this is an article that appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram in June of 1944. And it's just another example of gentlemen like W.S. Wilkinson being involved in things outside his chosen profession. Keep in mind, he was an attorney. But this says, the article, you see the headline, Sanitarium holds final exercises. 8 graduating nurses hear W.S. Wilkinson. Addressing the 8 seniors of the Rocky Mount Sanitarium School of Nursing at their graduation exercises held last night in the First Baptist Church, W.S. Wilkinson, local attorney, and by the way, this is the son. Remember, this father died in 1931, so this is the son. It says, local attorney discussing nursing services to humanity in time of peace and war. And it goes on to say, Dr. A.L. Daughtridge presented diplomas to the graduating class and commented on the students' work in the past and their plans for the future. Mrs. Margaret Ray, superintendent of nurses, presented the hospital pins to the graduates. Mr. Wilkinson was obviously a very busy man. He was on the board of directors at both Planters Bank as well as the Citizens Building and Loan Association. He was an attorney. He was obviously busy handling deeds and land transactions and other legal matters, and still had time to go speak to this class of graduating nurses at a time when the country was, obviously by 1944, the pandemic, the flu was over with, but we were engaged in war now. In June of 1944, there was, a big war effort going all over the country, and so nurses were in certainly in big demand, and it was neat that he would take time out of his busy schedule to go speak to these graduating nurses. So kudos to Mr. Wilkerson there for his efforts in the community. All right, I'll tell you what, Lee, let's go ahead then to item number 11. And I mentioned earlier that Mr. W.S. Wilkerson Sr. was one of the founders of Wilkerson Bullock and Company. And you see this ad appeared in 1945, and there was talking about the golden anniversary, 50 years. It was started in 1895, and this appeared 50 years later, 1945. And it says, beginning with a desk in Mr. Isaac Levy's cotton office on North Main Street, where he remained for about 1 year, W.S. Wilkerson then moved across from 5 Point Drug Store, now May and Gorham, with a, I can't even read this, here's a bit of smudge on the screen, something about close to Tom Huffin's Furniture Store. From this latter location, he moved to North Main Street, next door to where Rose Drug Company is today. And keep in mind, this article appeared in 1945, so they're talking about today being 1945. When the Planters National Bank building was erected in 1907, he occupied an office in the back of that building where he remained until 1929, after remodeling and renovating the present quarters of Wilkerson Bullock and Company. If you'll notice at the very bottom of the ad, it says that their address in 1945 was 126 North Main Street. Now, of course, they're over there on the corner of Sunset Avenue and Franklin Street. But that gentleman sitting down there is Mr. W.S. Wilkerson. And as I said, he was one of the founding members of Wilkerson Bullock. I was not able to find who the Bullock was in Wilkerson Bullock. I'm going to guess it was some relation to the Bullock Chevrolet family, but I don't know that. I could never make that connection between the two families, but certainly the Wilkinson and Wilkerson Bullock is Mr. W.S. Wilkerson Sr. Okay. All right, Lee, if we could, let's go to item number 12. Item number 12, and this is just one more example of what I've been referring to throughout the show tonight, of these gentlemen who were involved in various businesses, and at the same time were members of various boards and so forth. This appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram. This article appeared here, this photograph, in May of 1948. And if you see, it says members of the board. On May 4th, 1948, directors of the Planters National Bank and Trust Company gathered to have their photo taken. The members are deceased except Wiley Mears, who was vice president and cashier. From left to right, seated Joseph B. Brewer. I'm fairly certain that's the Brewer Paint Company family. Hyman L. Battle, Rocky Mountain Mills, of course. James P. Bunn, Thomas J. Pearsall, Robert D. Gorham, again, that would be Bobby Gorham's father that started Cherrytown Mall. R. Russell Brazel, Millard F. Jones, James C. Brazel, George S. Edwards, W. C. Woodard, Arthur Tyler, Francis Winslow, M. R. Robbins. Background standing, those three gentlemen at the back row standing there, left to right, Josh Horn, we spoke about Mr. Horn last week, W.S. Wilkinson, and W. Bruce Lee, that would be W.B. Lee Tobacco Company. So, you know, these are a group of Rocky Mount leaders, obviously. In 1948, you see most of these men appear to be certainly in their 50s, some in their 60s, maybe even 70. They're still working, still involved in this city, still very much engaged with what's going on in Rocky Mount. Decision makers, movers and shakers, whatever term you want to use, certainly applies to these gentlemen. And they were, by every measure of the word, very instrumental in bringing Rocky Mount along as a community and as a small city at that time. I think we've got time for one more before we go on break. Let's go to item number 13. This is another picture of Planters board members that appeared in March of 1949 when Planters Bank celebrated its 50th anniversary. And these pictures aren't very clear. I do apologize. But it says J.C. Brazel left. Chairman of the board receives hearty congratulations from Fred Green, Executive Secretary of the North Carolina Bankers Association, as Planters National Bank and Trust celebrated its 50th anniversary Saturday. The lady in the center of the picture on the left above is Mrs. Green. In the photo at the right, Planters Bank left to right, Miller Jones is greeted by two Wilson bankers. And the picture below, members of the board of directors were snapped in the bank on the institution's 50th birthday. The picture includes J.C. Brazel, George Edwards, and it goes on, the same ones I listed earlier. W.S. Wilkinson is certainly in here, of course. W.B. Lee, Josh Horn, Tom Pearsall, Henry Gregory, J.P. Bunn, M.R. Robbins, Joe Brewer, Alan C. Mims. These names, when you talk about the history of Rocky Mountain, you look back at the people that had a very big part in moving this city forward. You see the same names over and over and over again. And, it's a shame that we don't know more about these people. Many of us are too young to remember any of these people. I can't say I ever knew any of these men personally, but I can certainly respect what they did for the city of Rocky Mount during their time as a business leader and indeed a community leader. Okay, Lee, let's take our next commercial break. When we come back, folks, we're going to get to a few more items, and then we're going to show you some pictures of 600 Falls Road. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with more Way Back Wednesday.
I'm Daniel Moss, owner of Cornerstone Funeral Home, and I'd like to invite you and your family to give our family an opportunity to serve you in your time of need. And we offer a full line of funeral services, everything from visitations to graveside services to cremations on site with a live crematory, as well as a banquet hall to meet the catering needs of our families that we serve. We offer catering service. We offer refreshments prior to visitations and services of our family. And we want to invite you to come and experience the difference here at Cornerstone Funeral Home.
When faced with special care needs for elderly or disabled loved ones, families want compassionate, comforting care. That's Tender Touch Home Care Services' goal, providing the level of care we would expect for our own. With over 10 years of home care excellence, Tender Touch provides an array of services that keeps your loved one at home. From personal care, light housekeeping, errands, and meal preparation, to our private duty care program, which combines all of our home care offerings in one package.
Tender Touch Home Care Services, where your needs are our concern.
And we're back. Folks, if anybody's got any kind of input, any thoughts, anything you want to share with us, I forgot to put the number out earlier. 407-1111 is the number. Feel free to give us a call, and if you have any thoughts or memories about anything that we talk about tonight, feel free to call in and share your thoughts with us. We're talking about Mr. W.S. Wilkinson, and other gentlemen too, but primarily Mr. Wilkinson, because of the house that he lived in on Falls Road, in the 600 block of Falls Road. We've got a call right there. Let's get this call. Hello, caller, you on the air?
Randy, I wanted to mention W.S. Wilkinson.
Yes, sir.
Okay, his father was W.S. Wilkinson Sr., who organized the Citizen Savings and Loan in Wilkinson Bullock.
Right, that's right.
Almost one of the most prominent citizens that's ever come out of Rocky Mount. School board, the whole 9 yards.
Absolutely.
Well, his son was W.S. Wilkinson, and he was an attorney here.
That's right.
Well, W.S. Wilkinson, I got to know him pretty well when I was in the banking business, but he told me one time that he got to be a lawyer by reading law at the YMCA for 2 years, and that allowed him to take the bar exam.
How about that? That's interesting.
Also, while he was there was a Mrs. Dominic, who there's a street named after her out there on Sunset, and
Dominic
she did
Giant.
the same thing, and she became the first lady lawyer in North Carolina.
How about that? That's interesting. Sure is.
Rocky Mount was an extremely proud city, had 3 hometown banks and 4 savings and loans.
Yes, sir. It was
Those savings and loans all had corresponding banks. Like Citizen Savings was like Planters, and United Federal was like People's, and Home Savings was, like People's, and Builders Federal Savings and Loan was Bank of Rocky Mount.
Mm-hmm.
They all had a corresponding insurance and real estate business that went along with it.
Right.
Wilkes & Bullock, Twin County Insurance and Rental, Wimley & Gregory, and Standard Insurance and Realty.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Okay?
All
I
right.
just thought I'd give you that tidbit that Rocky Mount at one time had a law school.
Okay, buddy. I appreciate that.
Okay, goodbye.
Goodbye. Have a good night. Okay. All right. Yeah, certainly the Wilkerson family is well represented in the annals of Rocky Mountain history, no doubt about that. And being involved in starting so many different businesses. Oh, we got another call. Let's get this call. Hello, caller. You on the air?
Yes, I'm calling to see if anybody knows where Parkview Hospital used to be.
I do, actually. It was down there at you know where the Thompson Pharmacy used to be? You know where that was?
Yeah.
Kind of catacombs across from that. The library, the new library is down that way now. It was right there on the corner of Franklin Street and Falls Road, actually.
Didn't it used to be the old library was across from it?
Yeah, the old library building is still there. Yes, across Franklin Street. The old library is still there. It sure is.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good night.
You too.
Thank you. Okay. So, let's jump back into, we've got some pictures I want to share with them. We'll get to them in a little bit here, but let's go to item number 14. The caller a minute ago mentioned that Mr. Wilkerson was indeed involved with the Board of Education. And in 1957, this article appeared in the Rocky Mount Telegram, and it says, which item you got there, Lee? Which one is that? That's what number? That's 14. There you go. There's 14. Okay. You see the headline, Wilkerson School was erected 24 years ago. This article, as I said, appeared in March of 1957, and it said, Wilkerson School, one of Rocky Mount's 8 elementary schools, was erected in 1923 during the administration of R.M. Wilson, Superintendent of Schools. The school was built to satisfy the needs of the growing northwestern portion of the city of Rocky Mount. The school board responsible for establishing the school consisted of W.S. Wilkinson, chairman of the board, M.V. Barnhill, L.V. Bassett, J.C. Brazel, Mrs. Mary McDearman, T.T. Thorne, W.A. Bullock, J.Q. Robinson, and Mrs. Fiora F. Horn. So, indeed, Wilkerson School, of course, was named after W.S. Wilkinson. As I said before, I went to school there for first, second, and part of third grade, in fact. I have some very fond memories of that school, and my mother went there, in fact. So it's been around since 1923. A lot of folks went there over the years. Okay, Lee, let's go ahead then to item number, that was 4. Let's go to item number 15. And this was something I just thought was neat. It was a little blip that occurred. It appeared in the paper September 1964. And it talks about Dr. M.R. Brazel was born in Edgecombe County near Rocky Mount. And it's, of course, you see the headline says, "Do you know?" Now, I should have mentioned that prior to reading it, but it says, Dr. M.R. Brazel was born in Edgecombe County near Rocky Mount, December 12, 1864. He was a son of T.P. Brazel. Dr. Brazel studied at Bingham, Wake Forest, and the University of North Carolina, and graduated in medicine at the University of Maryland. He came to Rocky Mount in 1886. He married Mamie Hackney in 1894. They had 2 children, Tom and Mamie. Dr. Brazel owned considerable real estate in Rocky Mount and operated several farms. He was a stockholder in practically every Rocky Mount business which issued stock. In 1899, the North Carolina General Assembly elected the following to the Nash County Board of Education: T.V. Avent of Avonton, J.C. Bill of Red Oak, and Thomas Westry of Stanhope. Westry became chairman, and W.S. Wilkinson was named county superintendent. So, this was not the article I was thinking about, and I'm not sure that I brought it, but there was another article I was reading that during the 1917-1918 Spanish flu pandemic, Dr. Brazel's wife actually passed away. She caught the flu and passed away. So let's move on then, Lee. That was number 15. Let's go to item number 16. Item number 16 was when W.S. Wilkinson Jr., 1965, this article appeared in the Rocky Mountain Telegram. There's a picture there of W.S. Wilkinson Jr. upon retiring as an active director of Planters National Bank and Trust. He was presented a handsome sterling silver tray inscribed, and Ms. Josephine Smith, made the presentation. Wilkinson, a senior ranking member of the board of directors from point of service, was made an advisory director at the 66th annual stockholders meeting. So, and this article goes on to talk about his longevity with the bank. It says he has been a member of the bank's examining committee since January of 1933 and of the trust committee since January of 1943. He's been chairman of the examining committee for a number of years. He was made a director on April the 7th, 1931. So as a very young man, he was made a director of Planters Bank. So anyway, okay, Lee, so let's go ahead then to the next item. That was 16. Let's go to 17. And I think this is the article I was talking about that Leila Cheston wrote. A real good article. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's just very interesting to read. But it appeared in the Rocky Mountain Telegram in May of 1976. And in this article, she spoke with Mrs. Louise Wilkinson, who was the daughter of W.S. Wilkinson Sr. And his daughter was speaking here and says, the theaters, tobacco sales, warehouses, steamings and factories were closed. All the schools closed. We couldn't handle it. Miss Wilkinson was teaching at Red Oak at the time. Her father, the late W.S. Wilkinson of Rocky Mount, was a volunteer chairman of the local Red Cross. As the epidemic overtaxed existing hospital facilities, Wilkinson organized and directed emergency procedures to cope with the deadly virus. And it goes on to talk about, all these young women who were volunteering to provide aid and assistance. Some of them, of course, did catch the flu and die from the illness, but many of them survived. And the next picture, Lee, is a neat picture because it shows 4 very instrumental people. Upper left-hand corner, Susie Baskerville. She helped run a soup kitchen. And here you go, in the top right, here's the picture of Dr. Mark Brazel. The price he paid for helping in the flu epidemic was high, his wife. Bottom left, W.S. Wilkinson. He organized the local Red Cross. In the bottom right, Mrs. G.W. Bryan, the nurse who supervised the Washington Street soup kitchen. So all 4 of these people were very instrumental in getting aid and assistance to very sick people with a deadly disease, and they all risked their lives to provide that assistance. Okay, in 1985, January 85, W. Stronach, and I hope I'm pronouncing his middle name correctly, it's S-T-R-O-N-A-C-H, passed away. And there was certainly an obituary, and I read a little bit about it here. It's item number 19, if you want to put it on the screen for the viewers. The recent death of W. Stronach Wilkinson, Rocky Mount, loses a member of a distinguished family. Until ill health and advancing age curtailed his activities, Mr. Wilkinson had been associated with many activities which have meant so much to Rocky Mount. Not only had he been well known as a lawyer for over 50 years, he had rendered valuable service as the founder of important business firm. He also long served as director of the Rocky Mount YMCA. He was a member of the Rocky Mount Old Board of Aldermen. He had been actively affiliated with the First Presbyterian Church as an elder. He had been director of Planters National Bank and Trust. The list goes on and on and on, but anyway, you get the picture there. Obviously, very much involved in the community. So, okay, Lee, I think we've got one more or 2 more before we get to the house page. Let's go ahead and get to the item number, the next item should be item number 20, I think. That was 19. Yeah, this is just, I found this on the findagrave.com website. This is William, you see his middle name there, and I'm guessing that's pronounced Stronach, S-T-R-O-N-A-C-H. We got a call. Let's get this call. Hello, caller, you on the air?
All right, when you were speaking a minute ago about Thomas Hackney Brazel, who the library was named after, he was the firstborn child of Dr. Mark Russell Brazel and Mamie Hackney Brazel. Mm-hmm. And those 2 people they had 2 more daughters after the firstborn son. First one's name, I think, was Mamie, named after her mother, and she married Hyman Battle.
Right.
And then before Mrs. Dr. Mark Russell Brazel died, she had another daughter. There were a total of 3 children. Do not know what the last born child was, but I think there was the son. The library was named after Thomas Hackney Brazel, and then he had 2 sisters. They were both. The girls were both born, I think, before Thomas Hackney Brazel died in 1907.
Right.
All right.
Okay, buddy. Thank you. Okay. So one more thing I wanted to mention before we get to the pictures and before we go off the air here. I mentioned that there had been a few other occupants of 600 Falls Road, and one of those was Jimmy D. Smith, another local Rocky Mount tobacconist. There we go. In 1954, the Wilkerson family moved out of 600 Falls Road, and in 1955, Jimmy Smith and his wife moved into the home. And sadly, and you can put up item number 21 if you want to, Lee. Item 21 is actually the obituary for Jimmy Smith's wife, first wife, because he in later years remarried. But 2 years after not even 2 years, a little over a year actually, after they moved in to this beautiful home at 600 Falls Road, Jimmy's wife passed away, sadly. She was only 52 years old at the time, but she too, and again, I mean no disrespect when I use the term socialite, because I'm just saying that these people, were amongst the very affluent in Rocky Mount. And it goes on to say Miss Smith was a charter member of the Benvenue Baptist Church, a member of the Anne Hathaway Literary Club, Rocky Mount Women's Club, Benvenue Homemakers Club, and so, of course, surviving was her husband. They had one son, Jimmy, here at Rocky Mount, and she had a couple brothers and a sister. Okay, I mentioned that there was some. By the way, Lee, go ahead and if you would start showing these pictures to go off the air of the home itself. This beautiful home. There you have the front of it right there. 600 Falls Road is the address there. And there was 45. I only picked about a dozen of them to share with you tonight. But you can see that's the back of the house. In 1930, this home was occupied by a gentleman named John S. Dozier. And I have not found out anything about him yet. There just wasn't very much to be found. I'll keep doing some digging there. But anyway, 1941, William S. Wilkerson Jr. moved into the home. He and his wife moved into the home. And they were there, as I said, until 1954. In 1954, they moved out. In 1955, Jimmy Smith and his wife moved in. Oddly enough, from 59 to 63, I saw a reference to another gentleman by the name of Ivy Rollins Powell, who I think rented the building behind the main home. But as you can see by the pictures here, this was an absolutely gorgeous home. Still is, I'm sure. These pictures are fairly recent. I actually found these on one of the local real estate websites. I think it was Zillow. And as you can see, there was 45 pictures total, and I only picked a few of them to share with you. There's one of the bedrooms there. But this is a very stately home, very well built home, obviously. And in the 20s and 30s, up and down Falls Road, particularly as you got closer down toward downtown Rocky Mount, there were a lot of very prominent people who lived down there. And there were bankers and attorneys, obviously, and business owners. And so some of the, before the West Havens come along and the Inglewoods come along and these other prominent sections of Rocky Mount, Falls Road had its share of very wealthy, very well-to-do people, and the home certainly demonstrated that wealth in every measure. You can see here these homes, this one particularly is just very, very elegant all throughout the home. Folks, that's going to do it all for us tonight. Lee, you can just keep these pictures going as we go off the air here. Folks, thank you so much for joining with us tonight. We appreciate you calling in and sharing your thoughts and memories with us. Always my pleasure to be with you. Have a great week. Take care of yourself and be kind to one another. We'll see you next week with more Way Back Wednesday. Good night.